Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here. My name is Amy Cross. I am Managing Director of Advocacy at Impact for Equity. And I'll tell you a little bit about Impact for Equity. We are an organization that for over 50 years has been fighting for economic and racial equity in Chicago and Illinois. We were formerly called BPI, so you may know us by that name. But today we are Impact for Equity, which reflects our values and what we fight for. Today, our broad agenda for criminal legal system reform includes fighting to shrink the footprint of our carceral system in Illinois so that we can end the harm that it has caused thousands of people and foster healthier and safer communities. Over the last 5 decades in Illinois, this state has relied on policies that have led to a crisis of mass incarceration. So today, we're joined by a panel of experts on the Illinois prison system. And these experts will share their insights into how we can build a future beyond mass incarceration in Illinois. Last year, in March 2024, Governor Pritzker responded to a vocal movement to call out the dangerous, uninhabitable, and frankly inhumane conditions within the Illinois prison system by announcing a plan to demolish and rebuild Stateville and Logan correctional facilities at a cost of $900 million. At Impact for Equity, we thought about that, and we thought about how can we get involved. We ought to write Illinois decision makers a letter urging them to pause all of their plans to rebuild and to reevaluate how we as a state have created such a harmful system of mass incarceration in the first place so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. As we began to do this, we began learning from researchers and working in coalition with people and organizations that have advocated for criminal sentencing reform in Illinois for decades, which includes some of our panelists here today. We joined in coalition in the formation of a new coalition that is now called the Collective Liberation Coalition. And this is just one of many coalitions in Illinois and organizations that is fighting to shrink the footprint of our carceral system. And the Collective Liberation Coalition has taken this on as their central mission to shrink the carceral footprint in all of its forms. Our letter at Impact for Equity ultimately became a roadmap. And it's the roadmap that led to the report that we recently released, Pathways to a Future Beyond Mass Incarceration in Illinois. And this roadmap is essentially laying out a pathway toward ending mass incarceration in this state by changing 6 criminal sentencing practices that are not furthering public safety and are arguably aggravating it, making it worse by causing harm to the people that are impacted by them. We're not here to talk about specific legislation, although there is some. We are here to talk about our vision and policy shifts that we believe need to significantly change in the state to reduce incarceration in Illinois. It's not just one thing, and it's not just 2 things. There are many things that need to change. And today, we're going to talk about sentencing reform. We see this as an opportunity while these facilities are being closed, long overdue. This is an opportunity to talk about a future that doesn't lead to dilapidated, harmful, and inhumane prisons, and a future that isn't about caging people in the name of public safety when we know, after much research and decades of research, that it is not working and it is not producing that result. At the end of this or throughout the webinar today, we will be sharing information about how you can get involved. You will be hearing the names of different organizations and possibly publications, and we'll be sure to follow up with everybody who's attended today to share the recording and also other informational items about how you can get involved. So I will turn it over now to our first expert on the panel, my colleague, Andrea Dantas, who has authored this new report and is going to speak about some of these reforms that we've laid out in this roadmap of sorts. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I'm just going to take a moment to situate my screen here. 1 second. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Dantas. I am a staff counsel at Impact for Equity. And as Amy mentioned, I'm going to start us off by providing an overview of our new report entitled Pathways to a Future Beyond Mass Incarceration, to lay a foundation for our wonderful panelists who will be able to expand on a lot of these topics and provide a lot of their professional knowledge and experience to illustrate these topics further. This report that we just released compiles and builds on research from many of the people and organizations that are attending our webinar here today, and we are grateful to work with all of you and in coalition with many of you to move this work forward. Here's a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. I will start with a snapshot of the IDOC population we have today. Then I will move on to some of the policies that built the system. I will then go into the problem of long sentences. And finally, I will go through the 6 sentencing reforms that we discuss in our new report. Starting first with a snapshot, this provides a basic picture of the prison population in Illinois today. There are currently about 28,000 people incarcerated in Illinois. The 2025 annual budget for the Department of Corrections is about $2 billion. And then, as Amy just mentioned, there was an extra $900 million appropriated this year, which is, almost nearly an extra 50% appropriated for the rebuild of 2 of Illinois' oldest prisons. So the budget represents a significant investment of state resources. The prison system here includes 27 correctional facilities around the state, and some of those were built about 100 years ago. Some of them, they were built so long ago and have several years of deferred maintenance. And most of the prison facilities were built between the 1980s and the early 2000s. In direct response to the rapid growth of the prison population. So we have a system today that is, unfortunately, it is deteriorating because of the deferred maintenance and the age of the infrastructure. It is inefficient and it is not fit for modern understandings of rehabilitation or healthcare needs for the people inside. Let's take a closer look at the Illinois prison population over time. And I'm going to turn slightly this way because this is where I have the graph on my screen. This is a graph that the graph was prepared first by the Loyola Center on Criminal Justice. And it shows the IDOC population between 1980 and 2023. And I've added some markers here where new sentencing laws were implemented in Illinois that affected the prison population and sentence lengths. So in 1978, that was the year that Illinois abolished parole. Parole is a tool that people who are experiencing incarceration can use to petition for their own release. After serving a certain period of their sentence, they can petition for parole, and a parole review board can take different things into account, such as the amount of sentence that they have served, the changes that they've made, the circumstances of their original case, their age at the time of the original case, etc., and can make a determination about whether to allow that person to be released on parole back into their community. In 1978, for many different reasons, Illinois abolished parole, and that ended an opportunity for release for many people. And that contributed to sentences getting longer in Illinois. And as we can see at that point, because due in part to sentences getting longer, the population started to rise. Later, in 1998, another set of laws that lengthened prison sentences were implemented, and these are called truth in sentencing laws. Under truth in sentencing, people are required to serve a fixed percentage of their court-ordered sentence before they can earn any credit towards their release, any sentencing credits towards their release. And I will touch a little bit more on truth in sentencing later in this presentation. But because people were started being further limited in the sentencing credits they could earn, their sentence lengths also increased. So after parole was abolished, the prison population quadrupled. It started at the prison population in 1980 was around 12,000 people. And at its peak in 2013, it was nearly 50,000 people. And so you can see that, you can see that the population reached its peak in 2013, and that is the population that our prison infrastructure was built for. We have, that infrastructure was built in response to that rapid growth, and that is just not our current situation anymore. After 2013, the prison population starts to decline due to many different factors, including change in prosecutorial decisions, including changes in crime rates. And luckily, we have Dr. Olsen joining our panel this afternoon who can speak more to this. But the explanation for the decline in the prison population is not because of sentencing reforms that changed things like truth in sentencing, or that reinstituted parole. Those changes were not made. Because of that, the people who are serving long sentences are still there. They're aging behind bars, and they require rising healthcare costs and just general rising costs for incarceration as they get older. So as I was just starting to say, people are still being sentenced to long prison terms under tough on crime laws from the late 70s to the early 2000s. These include things like the truth in sentencing, the abolishment of parole, but this also includes other things like mandatory minimums and other sentencing enhancements. Those things made prison sentences longer and closed opportunities for release. So the opportunities for release are still mostly closed for those same people. If we want the prison population to continue to fall, like we saw it starting to decline after 2013, and to align with commitments to safety and racial equity and economic responsibility, we have to take on the policies that created the long sentences in the first place. Next, we're going to look at this snapshot, which the source is the John Howard Association. This is a snapshot showing the age at custody from the Department of Corrections population on June 30th of 2022. In other words, this graph shows how old people were when they were arrested for the charges that led to their prison sentences. The largest group of people in prison were arrested between the ages of 18 and 24. That reflects when the majority of behavior that people get arrested for, that's when that tends to occur. Further, the number of people arrested at older ages significantly lowers after age 24. This trend aligns with criminological research showing that people typically age out of crime or out of the behavior that leads to arrests. That behavior tends to peak in late teens and early 20s and then declines sharply afterwards. Unfortunately, though, because of lengthening sentences, nearly 1 in 5 people in the Department of Corrections are 50 years or older. Illinois' use of long sentences means people are aging in prison, and they're often serving decades for crimes for things that they were arrested for in their youth. So we continue to contribute to and have a growing elderly population with unique healthcare needs and rising costs, even as people's threat to public safety significantly decreases as they age. The laws that I've been talking about that increase sentencing lengths were also applied disproportionately to Black communities. Today, Black people make up 15% of Illinois' state population, but comprise 64% of people serving sentences longer than 20 years. And this pattern worsens as we see with people serving life sentences. 75% of people serving life sentences are Black. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposed reforms that would directly address long sentences that people are serving. Let's start with truth in sentencing, one of the biggest drivers of long prison terms in Illinois. Under these laws, people are required to serve fixed percentages of their sentences, regardless of whether they complete rehabilitative programs, maintain good behavior, or demonstrate growth. Truth in sentencing removes incentives for transformation, and it eliminates meaningful opportunities for people to earn their release by limiting their ability to earn sentencing credits. Ending truth in sentencing would allow people to earn time off their sentence through good behavior, through programs that build hope and skills, and that would make prison more rehabilitative and not just punitive. Next is the need to roll back mandatory minimums and sentence enhancements, which tie a judge's hands and fuel unnecessarily long sentences. These laws force long sentences regardless of a person's background, context, the circumstances, age, or potential for rehabilitation. Enhancements like stacking charges or adding time for certain facts such as possession of a firearm often disproportionately impact Black and Brown people. Ending these policies would allow courts to weigh the full circumstances of each case. Next is reinstating parole. Illinois is one of just a handful of states that eliminated parole and has not reinstated it since. Without parole, many people are sentenced to decades or life with no meaningful review of their sentence, even if they've changed profoundly. Reinstating parole would give people an opportunity to demonstrate readiness for release and allow a parole board to make individualized evidence-based decisions. This change would particularly impact older people, many of whom pose little to no risk, but are still incarcerated at high cost to taxpayers. We also need a formal mechanism for courts to revisit past sentences. Second look laws allow for resentencing after a certain amount of time has passed, especially for those who have shown rehabilitation. These laws are already gaining traction across the country and are based on the idea that over time, the original sentence may not be just anymore. Expanding second look in Illinois would help address outdated sentencing policies. Next is reforming accountability laws. Illinois' accountability theory is very broad and deeply harmful. It allows people to be charged and punished just as harshly as the person who committed a crime, even if they didn't intend the outcome or were only marginally involved. These laws have disproportionately impacted young people and women, especially those coerced into situations by peers or abusive partners. Finally, we must ensure that when laws change, those changes apply to everyone, not just future cases. So we must expand retroactivity. Illinois has passed important reforms, but too often they don't apply retroactively to people already incarcerated under old laws. We've already recognized this principle in past reforms, like ending juvenile life without parole. We can do it again. Retroactivity is about equity and consistency and making sure our system reflects current values, not outdated punishments. I have just given a very quick and brief overview of 6 huge undertakings. And I know that there are many more details, a lot more statistics, a lot more research, and a lot more humanity in those examples. So I would encourage everyone to read our report and also to get involved. But I'll move on to my conclusion. With the governor's announcement of plans to close 2 of the state's prisons, we are finally acknowledging what advocates, impacted people, and experts have been saying for decades. Our current prison system is unsustainable, it is ineffective, and it's costly. This moment is an opportunity to take a look at how we got here and to change course. Instead of spending money to rebuild our current system, we can move away from outdated sentencing practices that led to mass incarceration, and we can replace them with policies rooted in rehabilitation and public safety. The reforms in this report have been demonstrated in different places across the country. They're informed by research, grounded in lived experience, and supported across the state of Illinois. If we commit to them, we can build a smaller system of justice without affecting public safety that restores communities and reflects our values. I will now transition us to our panel portion of the event and turn things over to my supervisor, Loren Jones. Loren Jones is the director of the Criminal Legal Systems team at Impact for Equity, and she'll be introducing our panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we have a panel of amazing advocates and impacted people who've been working on these issues for a very, very long time. I'm just going to dive into it because I think we're going to have a really robust conversation, and I just want to get to the meat. So first up, we have Avalon Betts-Gaston. She is the executive director of the Illinois Alliance for Reentry and Justice. She works to dismantle and rebuild systems of accountability centered on humane justice, care, and harm reduction, rather than punishment and retribution. A Chicago native, non-licensed attorney, and ordained minister, Avalon is the first formerly incarcerated board chair of Community Renewal Society and serves on multiple boards, including the Free Her Campaign Advisory Council and Chicago Votes. Avalon is also a 2023 Soros Justice Fellow and a 2022 JLUSA Leading with Conviction Fellow. Avalon holds a bachelor's degree from DePaul University and a JD from UIC, or formerly John Marshall Law School. Next, we have Jimmy Soto joining us today. Jimmy is a legal professional, advocate, and paralegal at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, where he works to advance justice and accountability in the Illinois legal system. A graduate of the Northwestern Prison Education Program, Jimmy brings lived experience and deep policy insight to his work, particularly in the areas of parole reform and prison system accountability. He's a leading voice behind the Build Communities Not Prisons campaign, which calls for investment in people and neighborhoods rather than the proposed rebuild of Stateville and Logan correctional centers. Jimmy's experience as an exoneree, combined with his legal training and community leadership, inform his powerful advocacy at a more humane and effective system of justice. Lastly, we have Dr. Dave Olsen. Dave Olsen is a professor in the Criminal Justice and Criminology Department at Chicago and co-director of Loyola's Center for Criminal Justice Research. With more than 35 years of experience, Dr. Olsen has worked extensively with state and local agencies to evaluate correctional policies and sentencing practices. He currently serves on several state boards, including advisory roles with the Illinois Department of Corrections and the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. His research has shaped policy through appointments to numerous gubernatorial commissions and task forces. A prolific scholar and recipient of multiple awards for his contributions to criminal justice, Dr. Olsen brings deep expertise in sentencing and justice system reforms. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start off with a general question. Can each of you share just a little bit about how you have personally worked to change the Illinois prison system and why sentencing reform matters to you? And we can start off with Avalon, since I introduced you first.
Thanks, Loren, and thanks, Impact for Equity, for having me today. So I come to this work as a recovering attorney, but also as a formerly incarcerated person and as a Black woman in America, right? I realized through my experiences that the systems that we currently have really are rooted in practices and ideologies that are not helpful to people of color being in their fullness, being healthy and recognized as full community members in the world. And so with regard to the prison system in particular, I realized firsthand that there was really something wrong there. Everything that society teaches you about the carceral system does not exist in reality. There's theory and then there's practice. And so when I realized that there was a huge chasm between theory and practice or perception and reality, I realized that was on purpose and we needed to do something about it. And doing something about it is really leaning into things that really enhance public safety. And we know now, right, through the result of brain evidence, brain development evidence, and things like that, that our responses upon which this system was built are inadequate to enhance public safety. And I do want to note that today is the anniversary of the Rockefeller drug laws. Today is the day that Governor Rockefeller enacted the first of many drug laws to kick off the war on drugs, decades of just violence in communities of color. And so it is great that we're having this conversation on this particular day.
Thank you. Drop in history. I didn't even know. So I'm glad we chose today. Dr. Dave Olsen, could you answer this question for us?
Sure. And like everybody, thanks for organizing this and inviting me. The way I look at the work I do is recognizing that all of us play a role in improving society. There's people that advocate for change. There's practitioners that have to implement change. There's impacted individuals that can speak from direct experience. And then there's people doing research, which is the group that I fall into. One of the things that I'm motivated by, although it's also frustrating, is oftentimes the problems that we face and the solutions that are framed are unconnected with reality. There's a lot of rhetoric used to get people to perceive certain things as problems and as solutions. So what motivates me, or what I want to try to accomplish with the work that I do, is I want criminal justice policies to be effective and efficient. If they don't achieve their goals or they're not implemented as intended, we should improve them. The only way we can understand that is if we do research, if we apply an objective, rigorous process to understand whether or not these policies that were offered as solutions to the problem are grounded in an empirical understanding of the issues, and that they actually have an effect. I think with a lot of reforms that we see, they're not implemented as intended, or they don't have the effect that's intended. And unfortunately, we're reluctant to ever change them, even if we have evidence that they didn't achieve what they did, because they just become part of our system or our process. So that's really the thing that I try to strive towards is providing an objective voice in some of these conversations. I've been fortunate enough in the work that I've done to serve as staff to a variety of task forces and commissions, and also be members of those commissions where I can provide my input based on the research that I've done.
Thank you. And we're going to get all into why some of that evidence doesn't translate to change. But Jimmy, could you share how you're working to change the prison system and why sentencing reform matters to you?
Well, I'll answer the latter. First of all, thank you all for having me here. I appreciate it. I'll answer the latter part of that question first, which is why it's so important to me. Obviously, I spent 42 years wrongfully convicted in the IDOC. I was there, ground level experience, seeing when the laws changed. I came there in 82 into the system. 81, I was locked up. 82, I entered the system in IDOC, and I saw firsthand that the majority of people were parole eligible. Here I am with a natural life sentence without parole, 20 years old, and I really didn't know how to navigate the system. But I will say the way it impacted me and others were gradually those that were sentenced in the 78 law, which is the Class X felony law, or the determinate sentence law, where you earn day for day. And I wasn't privy to earn any good time. So that right there was a starting point for me to realize that, hey, wait a minute, something's inherently wrong with the system, particularly with I was sentenced to under the theory of accountability, meaning I didn't shoot anybody. The principal offender, because his jury found him not guilty of one count of murder, he got a lesser sentence to me, earned a day for day, and got out in 96, where I had to wait until December 23 to be released. But I also saw when they brought in this truth in sentencing law, when they also brought in the mandatory add-ons, et cetera, these enhancements, and you could see, and I saw when the prison reached its plateau of this record number and when it decreased. But there are many factors that attribute to people staying in there as well, which we didn't cover, and I don't want to get too legalistic. And that is the changes in the ability for people to challenge their convictions. Meaning, in Illinois, when I got in the system, it was 20 years to file a post-conviction. It got reduced to 3 years, 6 months. The crime bill by Bill Clinton, or the ADAPA, the Anti-Terrorist Effective Death Penalty Act, made it where you only had 1 year once you finish your direct appeal to go to the federal court and challenge a conviction via a federal habeas corpus. So these are a lot of factors that really cut people at the knees and not giving them many opportunities to challenge these convictions, many of which were based upon either tainted evidence, hidden evidence, et cetera. And so I've seen it. I worked on probably well over 600 criminal cases in my time in there. And I could tell you, I've had successes, but I've seen time and time again that people had really viable claims, but because of procedural hurdles, they were no longer able to do that. So I just wanted to add that point. As far as why I am so motivated to work, aside from me being wrongfully convicted, was the fact that when I got out, a friend of mine and colleague, I graduated from Northwestern Prison Education Program. Michael Broadway died because of an asthma attack at Stateville. And right there, he didn't have to die. The windows were sealed shut, etc. Everybody knows that the prison should have been closed a long time ago. I saw the deterioration and the poor maintenance that happened, and literally chunks of concrete falling from the ceiling. It just was terrible. So Michael did not have to pass away. Well, with that, I started my Build Communities Not Prison campaign, but I worked with attorneys at Lovey and Lovey. I worked with other organizations in the city of Chicago. I got as many in front of as many cameras and talked to as many press that would listen to me saying that Stateville has to be closed. I'm not saying I was the key component to see Stateville closed, but I definitely pushed in that direction. And I feel that if I could do it there, why not can't do it to Logan? Why can't we do it to these other prisons that need to be closed? And like you started off, with this report, as Andrea said, is that I can't wrap my head around spending close to $1 billion to rebuild 2 prisons when in fact there's no really need for it. The only message I could take away from that is they are anticipating some type of upsurge in crime, or that we are going to lock up future generations.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And there's so many reasons to come to this work, and your testimony is really powerful. I wanted to backtrack to how we got here a little bit. And this question is for Dr. Dave Olsen. Based on your research, how have sentencing policies impacted the size and demographics of the Illinois prison population? And what else has impacted the size of the population? So I know Andrea pointed you out in the presentation that there's lots of factors that led to this decline. So if you could explain on that.
Sure. I think I'll start with a simple explanation and then explain why it's not so simple. So the real simple way to understand what influences the size of a correctional population is it's driven by 2 factors: how many people are admitted and how long do they stay, right? So it's in quote simple: how many admissions and how long do people stay? Then we have to start unpacking what changes the number of people admitted to prison, and what changes how long they stay, to really understand what's going on. So with some things that influence how many people are admitted to prison, that can be the cause. The cause of that could be just simply that crime goes up. If there's more crime and the police arrest more people, all things being equal, there'll be more people that are sentenced to prison. In the late 1980s, we saw a fairly large increase in crime, particularly violent crime. 1992 was one of the highest rates of homicide in Illinois. There were a lot of arrests associated with that. But we also had an increased emphasis by law enforcement on drug law violations, right? So we have kind of 2 dynamics. We have a true increase in the amount of crime, things like robbery and other serious crimes, but also an increased emphasis on enforcing certain laws like drug law violations. So we've seen during the 80s and 90s a dramatic increase in admissions. And in recent years, we've seen a fairly large drop in admissions, right? So that helps us understand why the prison population went up and went down to some degree. The other thing that influences the population size is how long do people spend there? And that's where things that Jimmy pointed out start to come into play. Sentencing enhancements began to be added to crimes that if you had certain types of prior convictions, you were given an enhanced or a longer sentence. If you possessed a firearm or used a firearm in the commission of a violent crime, that enhanced your sentence length. And then we have truth in sentencing, which also has impacted how long people spend in prison. Another trend or pattern that I think is behind this that it's important to understand is the decisions about who we sentence to prison and who we place on probation also affects the number of admissions to prison. And so during the 1980s and 1990s, when kind of the law, or the tough on crime and the law and order approach was popular, a large share of people sentenced for a felony offense were given a prison sentence. So if you go back to the 90s, about 50% of all people convicted of a crime where they could have gotten probation received a prison sentence. Last year, that percentage dropped to 30%, meaning that the use of prison as a response to crime for the crimes that are eligible for probation has shifted. We're using probation more now than we did 10 or 15 years ago, and that helps us to understand why the prison population has dropped. Part of the reason why it hasn't dropped as much as it potentially could have are policies like truth in sentencing. And I want to spend just a second explaining or talking about that, because that really is what's sustaining the size of the Illinois Department of Corrections population right now. When truth in sentencing was being debated, and again, I was staff to the commission, the Truth in Sentencing Commission, there were 2 theories as to what would happen. One theory was we're going to impose truth in sentencing where people have to serve a certain % of their sentence, but judges are just going to adjust how long the sentences are. To keep the math really simple, the average sentence to prison for a murder offense prior to truth in sentencing was around 40 years. You had to serve 50%. After truth in sentencing, you had to serve 100%. And so everyone assumed, okay, judges are just going to cut sentences in half. And the net result will be people spend just as long in prison. That's not what happened. The lengths of sentences did not change at all. And as a result, people convicted of those offenses are spending twice as long as they did previously. The impact of that now is that more than half of all the people serving a sentence in Illinois' prisons are subject to truth in sentencing. And just 15 or 20 years ago, that percentage was only around 15%, right? So we're seeing the effect of those long sentences where people aren't being released and therefore aren't being eliminated from the prison population.
Thank you. And that's a really helpful fact whenever I hear it, because I think about how you'll see a sentence, someone that is not serving a sentence will see it and say, that seems fine, but not realize that 20 years ago or less than, a couple decades ago, it was half that amount of time. In that vein, I would love to hear from Jimmy and Avalon about their perspective working on the ground and how these long sentences impact the people that are serving them, and the communities that they're from, their families. Can we start with Jimmy?
Sure. One of the other factors that also, I believe, weighed in on an increase in the prison population or those getting long-term sentences was the lack of mental health services in our communities. I saw a dramatic increase in people who had mental health problems. But the very fact that you spend decades in prison being treated the way you are because of the way the policies are in that culture within the prison system can weigh on people, and they then develop mental health problems. And so there is an increase of mental health problem in there. And why I say all that is because you know, you see that happening and they're not getting the help that they need. So that's an impact because of long-term sentences. You've now subjected somebody to have these psychological problems. I myself suffer from severe trauma because of that, and I'm thankful that I'm able to get help for that. But a lot of people in there do not get help, or they try to find whatever way they can to try to self-medicate, which is really sad. With that said, as well, I saw the impact that it has on people's, not only the individual, but to their loved ones. When they come, they have to get money from them, and people coming from low income areas can't afford to have that, or they ask for a lawyer. I know my father took out a second loan. I know so many other families that have done that as well and put themselves in long-term debt because of long-term incarceration of their loved one. So there is so much that affects and that's tethered to long-term incarceration. I just want to just add one other point, and that is that um, the communities have a void of a lot of people that are not there that can do some great work. I don't want to give a laundry list of all the individuals that I know personally that got out and are thriving and doing very wonderful work and are successful. But there's just this whole idea that people have to serve decades, and this is going to somehow um, get them to no longer be a threat to society. I would say that once someone reaches their 40s, they probably pretty much have aged out of any criminality. But there's data that supports that. Um, and like I said, I just know that it just so many people are suffering because their loved one is serving a long-term sentence, let alone trying to go visit them. A lot of times they got to go downstate, and it's money to cost to get there and et cetera. So it's so much that is tethered to that, as I said, that impacts not only the individual but those that care about him and his community.
Yeah, excuse me. And to just kind of piggyback on, I just want to give an actual kind of like real time example of what Jimmy is talking about as far as the extraction of resources. So not only did we disappear the individual, the human being from their community, right now with the new system, the new core link system that IDOC has transitioned to, the cost to communicate with your loved one has increased by 52% from what it was under GTL. So if you think about that, these are already communities that have been divested from for more than my lifetime, right? They suffer from environmental injustice, they suffer from carceral injustice, all of these things. And now, on top of that, we decided that they are going to bear the brunt, the financial brunt of sustaining this system, so that billionaires can own basketball teams on the backs of poor people in Chicago's West and South Sides. Like, I just think that that's abhorrent, and it's just, we need to just call that out. But I want to talk about it from the women's perspective, right? Black women now have the fastest incarceration rate, right? The rate of incarceration is the fastest. We are being pumped into systems that were built for men, and in particular, if we're honest, Black men, right? So our clothing is men's clothing. All of the programs are geared towards men. All of the resources do not take into consideration that 76% of the women in IDOC were mothers of minor children, according to the Women's Justice Institute Redefining the Narrative report, and 80% are mothers. So nothing within this system is geared towards the incarceration of women in a way that's rehabilitated in any way, shape, or form. And so when you think about it, like, okay, what is the goal? If the goal is public safety, the goal is to return people to useful citizenship as required per our Constitution. When we put people in systems that's not designed for their gender identity, that's not designed for their family makeup, how are we restoring them to useful citizenship, right? Like, how is that outcome happening? And I would argue that it is not happening. But what is happening is the disappearing of people who continue to look like Jimmy and I into these systems, into these places of hell. And I would argue, in my opinion, that that's actually the point. The point is to do that, because if they really cared about the rest of the stuff, it was really truly about public safety, then they would ensure that as they increase the population of women into these systems, that they were increasing the needs, the gender responsive care that women need, and they're not doing that. So it is obvious to me, not based on theory, but based on actual experience, that the intent was never to actually to better the people that are put in these systems. And so, and I don't know that the culture would allow that to happen anyway, on top of that. So, you know, when you put people in longer sentences, you have women who are trying to parent in 15-minute conversations to minor children, right? Their children now are experiencing ACEs, right? And then that means that their brain development is being changed, literally changing the physical development of their brain. Like, we know now that a brain is not fully developed until people are 25. So I am not surprised that antisocial behavior peaks between the ages of 18 and 24. If we know that, then why is our response that we want to put people in cages when we know that their brain hasn't been fully developed, right? Like, I'm not making good decisions because my brain is not capable of making that, because it's not developed to do that, right? In every circumstance. And then when you add ACEs, 90% of the people in IDOC have identified experiencing at least one ACE, which is an adverse childhood experience, which also impacts brain development. So when we know all of these things, and our response is still, well, we're just gonna throw you in a cage, are we really thinking about public safety, or are we just thinking about incapacitation and disappearing people and punishment? Because if that's the case, let's just own it. Let's just stand on that and say, this is really what we want to do. We want to punish you, we want to incapacitate you, and we want to disappear you. We don't really care about meeting our constitutional edict of returning you to useful citizenship. Let's just say that out loud. And then we can then begin to have an honest conversation about what the solutions need to be. But these long sentences only make that worse. And it makes it worse, especially for women, and in particularly Black women, who are now being pumped into these cages at rates exceeding everyone else.
Thank you, Avalon. On the research side of this question, Dave, could you talk about the relationship in the data between long sentences and public safety outcomes, and if there is one?
Yeah, I think part of it, I want to kind of build off of what Avalon brought up, and that's what is the purpose of prison. And there's the articulated purpose, there's the purpose that's used in rhetoric when advancing policies. There's the purposes from the standpoint of the true purposes, and then there's the question of whether or not those goals are achieved through not only the sentence to prison, but the duration of time in prison. So that's kind of a long introduction to your question. But I think the way that I'd summarize the research is most of the research that exists suggests that it's not so much the severity of the punishment that has a deterrent effect. It's the certainty of punishment, right? And so the idea there, or the theory there, is you get a better response in terms of behavior if the likelihood of having a sanction imposed, there's a high likelihood of it, but it doesn't really matter the duration or the severity of the punishment. So I think when we're talking about long sentences, the research is fairly consistent that long sentences do not achieve the deterrent effect that they expect, right? They do achieve, as Avalon pointed out, punishment, severe punishment, lengthy punishment. And I think part of what we have to wrestle with is, at what point do we feel that we still need to spend a lot of money to achieve punishment? Is 10 years of punishment sufficient, or do we really need 20 or 30 or 40 years of that punishment? Some people would argue that yes, we do, but we've got to recognize that all those additional decades come at an enormous cost to society in terms of the money that we have to spend to support that. The way I look at it is, if we are seeking to reduce crime and violence and improve public safety, then we should focus on what is it that will achieve those goals, right? What will change behavior? Deterrence changes it a little bit, but we know from research there are a lot of other more effective ways to improve behavior, improve cognition, address the trauma that people have experienced. I think we're still kind of stuck on this idea that people deserve some sanction, right, and some punishment. But I think it's balancing, okay, how much punishment is appropriate, and at what point are we spending money on things that aren't achieving gains in public safety? In other words, we could reallocate those resources to a policy that would actually prevent people's involvement in crime or improve their success when they're released. I think one thing I also wanted to bring up that I forgot to mention is when you bring together people and provide them with the research and the evidence and allow them to engage in a thoughtful process, you can come up with bipartisan agreement that we need to change some of these policies. I was fortunate enough to be a commission member on the Criminal Justice and Sentencing Reform Commission that Governor Rauner created. We came up with a series of recommendations that were voted on by the majority of members, that was bipartisan in its membership, that recommended that truth in sentencing be scaled back, that some of the enhancements that we have in place be scaled back. And it was really because we were reflecting on what value does that serve in terms of improving public safety, and we couldn't really find anything in terms of improving public safety. Did it achieve retribution? Yes, but it came at an enormous cost.
Thank you. You started to go a little bit into the messaging aspect of this, of the political aspect of getting these things done. And I want to ask Avalon, I know you have a lot of experience in directly combating these narratives. What are some of the tools that you use to advocate for these reforms in the face of those challenges? And, what can you share about that experience?
Yeah. I mean, we have society and propaganda has done an excellent job of indoctrinating us into thinking that law and order and CSI and all of those things is really how the system operates, and we have been really trained well to think that there has to be some kind of punishment as a result, in response to harm. And I think that, you know, we really need to challenge that. And I think that because I do believe in accountability, I absolutely believe in accountability. You cause harm, there has to be some form of accountability. But I'm not sure that what we consider justice or the version of punishment that we want to mete out on people who have caused harm or not caused harm in the case of Jimmy and myself, um, would it is actually appropriate, right? Or is it more detrimental to the individual? And so when I think about it within that context, and I'm like, okay, right, punishment to what end, right? Like, what is it actually accomplishing, and what would accountability look like instead? And so for me, because I think that we have this thing, like, because people, applaud, like, are they going to go to jail and get raped? And it's just this whole mentality that we, and ideology that we have, that's part and parcel of society, right? That we feel like the worse your experience is in a cage, somehow that is better for society. And I really want us to interrogate that in a way that says, is it really? Because if we're returning people back to society, and because 90+% are going to come back to their communities, if we're returning to society worse emotionally, physically, mentally, than they were when they went in with an undeveloped brain, because most went in young. When Jimmy went in, his brain wasn't fully developed, right? So when we're returning them worse off than they were, is that actually helpful in the long run, right? So that, and then so that punishment accomplished what, other than making some people feel better about the horrors that people experience. And I think that we need to interrogate why people want that first and foremost. But above and beyond that, so like when I think about it, I often challenge, like, my physical appearance challenges the narrative of being a victim, also being formerly incarcerated. And so we have to tell our stories, but we have to tell our stories on our terms. And they have to be, they can't be diminished or demeaned or erased because it's not packaged in the way that you feel it should be packaged, or that it does not possess the same ideology that you possess, right? Like, victims are not a monolith. People who cause harm are not a monolith. There are a variety of things that determine those particular situations, and so we have to really talk about that. But I think at the core of narrative change work is us doing the hard work of questioning our why. Why do we think these things should exist? Why do we believe that this should be the response to harm that happens in our community? Why? So we have to do that internal hard work. And so for me, I'm always challenging myself. And then as I challenge myself, being honest about my challenges, and then talking to others about it, sharing my story, talking about what really helps, right? Like, we know the top three factors that contribute to incarceration are poverty, mental health, and substance use disorder. And substance use disorders is tacked onto mental health. A cage in our current imprisonment and incarceration process does nothing to improve people's poverty rate. In fact, it makes it worse because they're paying people, if they're paying them at all, cents per hour, and the rest of that money is coming from the community, right? So the poverty rates are not improved by incarceration. Mental health rates are not improved by incarceration, and substance use disorder is not improved by incarceration. So we know those are the top three drivers of incarceration. Our solutions are not attacking the very things that cause incarceration. And so for me, that's a disconnect. And we need to interrogate that. And we need to talk about, yes, here's what causes people to become incarcerated. Here's what incarceration does. It does not deal with these things. And what do we want to do about that? Right. And so that's really where a lot of our narrative change work lies, in talking to the community. We have to talk to the people on the block educating them about this disconnect. Despite the fact that CS law and everybody else, prosecutors will and judges will clearly say, well, they're all connected. It helps. And we have to challenge that. We have to say, actually, well, no, it doesn't. And here's why. And really have those hard conversations, those kitchen table conversations with the people in our communities to get them to understand that there is daylight between what causes incarceration and our response as a result of that supposedly is supposed to address those root causes, which in fact does not do that in any way, shape, or form.
I love that. Thank you so much. This next question is for all the panelists, but I want to start with Jimmy. In the coming years, Illinois is posed to spend, as you all know, probably over $1 billion on rebuilding prisons. What are the priorities you think the state should take up to minimize or prevent the harm of an expanding system?
Well, to me, it seems like they've given no thought to whether or not they should address these truth and sentencing and these other natural life without parole, or for that matter, people who have spent decades in prison. There's no conversation about providing for them a pathway to release. We know that the clemency system is ineffective. There are close to 2,000 sitting on the governor's desk. So they have no other redress or recourse where they can try to get out of prison. With that said, there's also no conversations with all stakeholders. In other words, this is a lot of money. You're talking about $1 billion that you're going to spend to rebuild these aesthetically, Norwegian type prisons that he envisions. But he's only announced that he's going to close Stateville and Logan and put people there, presumably, where the former population of Stateville behind the wall before it closed was 400 people. There's no conversation about how Dave Olsen has said that, we've had this decrease. And this report as well illustrates very well how we've had a dramatic increase between the pre and post pandemic population in prison. But their thought is that the budget has not changed for the IDOC, despite close to 23,000 decrease in the population. You still got the same amount that you're allocating for the overall DOC and the same amount that you're allocating to each individual facility. So these are all red flags, and they need to have a serious conversation, or to have a serious group of people. Have a group of people to have that serious conversation, which you invite stakeholders like Avalon, like people at Impact for Justice, like Dave Olsen, and to sit down along with IDOC, ASME Union, because the union is such a big thing. Of course, they're going to advocate for that, and of course, they're going to back the governor with his rebuild. But at what cost? And it flies in the face of logic that we are not looking, as Avalon pointed out, to these three factors which attribute to this increase in population in the prison system in the 80s all the way to the present date. Well, there is a decrease. But anyway, people continue coming to prison because of those three factors, which is, of course, mental health, poverty, and, of course, substance abuse. So, I've heard no conversation of trying to direct any of this money towards that end, towards the front end, as opposed to spending it on the back end into these prisons. So to me, it seems like nobody has really given this much thought, other than saying, I want to look at and see a shiny new prison, but it's still a prison nonetheless. So why are we even doing this? So I would hope that people would make enough noise. I know I am, as far as saying, why are we spending this amount of money, particularly in these economic times? We know what's coming out of Washington. Taxes are going up. I just saw this morning on the news that there's going to be an increase in gas come July. So, people cannot afford to make it paycheck to paycheck. The grocery bills are still up. And yet you're going to tell me that you're going to find money to build a $1 billion rebuild for 2 prisons. So I would leave you with that thought and leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Dave?
I think to kind of build on what Jimmy's bringing up, I've been doing this for a long time, and the message I've always heard with reform and implementing new policies is it will in the end save us money. We'll have less crime. We'll spend less money responding to crime. Half of that we've achieved, right? From when I started, crime is down from what it was in the 90s. The research shows that it's not because of incarceration, right? So I want to kind of clarify that, right? So crime is down. We've invested a lot of money in a lot of different things, improving schools, improving access to health care, all sorts of things. And crime's down, and the prison population's down. And so, at least as a taxpayer who again looks for ways that we effectively and efficiently respond to problems, there were a lot of savings we were promised. The savings haven't yet materialized. And usually when people do assessments of what will be the savings from reductions in crime, the largest area where there are theoretically reductions is in incarceration, because that's the most expensive part of the process. So to Jimmy's point, we've got a population that's half of what it used to be a decade ago. Most people would assume, oh, that must mean we spend half of what we used to spend. That's not the case. And so kind of think about it from the standpoint of a, in quote, a traditional free market, right? If there was a good or service that people just did not want anymore or didn't consume at the level that they historically had, would those stay in business? Would we have as many companies producing whatever it is now that's out of favor, right? You probably can't buy a phone that hangs on your wall as easily anymore. Why? Because the public doesn't want it anymore. And I think what we've seen over the last 2 decades is through the democratic process and electing representatives and prosecutors and judges, we don't want as much prison as we used to. That shows with changes in sentencing practices. Yet we still invest the same amount of money in that component of the system. So I'd like people to at least reflect on that you know, in the era of government efficiency, I won't use the full acronym, right? There's this idea we should really scrutinize what government spends money on. I've always been for that. We should understand and scrutinize what we're spending money on, and are we getting out of that investment what we expected. I think there's some areas where it's taboo to say that we should scrutinize the spending on certain things. But I think with this, I think we need to, and again, to recognize that if the goal is public safety, we don't achieve any more of that at a certain point with long sentences. And so I think it's not just about, oh, maybe we need fewer prisons or fewer resources spent on prison. I think that kind of the theme of this panel and the report is we should also be questioning as to whether or not we need the numbers of people in prison that we currently have, because unless we are willing to admit that this is only about punishment, it's not about deterrence, it's not about public safety, and to also admit, as some elected officials have publicly, that this is about jobs, right? This is about employment opportunities in parts of the state where there aren't a lot of opportunities. And I'm not saying anything that's a surprise to many people, because we've had governors of the state say that we can't close that prison. It provides too many good paying jobs. And you know, at least they were being honest. But is that what the purpose of prisons is, right? If the rhetoric is it makes us all safer, but the science says that that's not what it does, and the real reason is it's about jobs, then I think we just need to think about how we're investing those resources better.
Thank you. And Avalon, could you wrap up this question for us?
Yeah, so I think about, like, right now I'm on part of a coalition that's dealing with the water crisis in IDLC, right? We're talking about spending $1 billion on building prisons, and that we're going to keep the vast majority of everyone else drinking on potable water, right? Like, I don't understand that. People should be able to shower and brush their teeth and do those things, even if they are incarcerated. And that $1 billion, to me, should be spent on the front end, like Jimmy said. Because that's just, if we really want to be serious about public safety, we want to address the root causes. We do not, like, we coming after the fact is not as helpful as addressing the root causes, right? But then if we're gonna spend some money, let's spend the money on the ones that they feel like, you know, must remain in the system, and have them be available to, you know, to be able again to brush their teeth. You know, people are still having to purchase water to brush their teeth in IDOC facilities. Make it make sense. And so for me, it's like, okay, we talk about we want to build these new prisons. If they're going to build it, they will fill it, and it's going to be filled with our great grandchildren. Let's just be honest about that, right? But we're not talking about the current crisis. And so if we say we want to deal with the deferred maintenance bill tab, which is $2 billion, plus the $1 billion for these new prisons, we're talking about $3 billion, and we can't find any other better way to spend $3 billion on public safety. I find that unusual and weird, if I'm honest. And so I just would want us to be us and as community members to demand more. Like Dr. Dave said, it's your money. Does your community have parks that kids can play in? Do they have the actual nets on the basketball hoops in the parks? Do they have access to clean air and drinking water in your community? Like, we're talking about spending money on this system that hasn't lived up to the expectations, when we should be thinking about the other things. And so I challenge the community members to think more about, like, where do I want this money spent? What do I deserve as a community member for my tax dollars to be spent on, and not just be told that your tax dollars are going to be best spent on these things. Like, look in your community and see, what do you need for you and for the people, your neighbors.
Thank you, Avalon. I feel like "Make it make sense" is a great tagline for any campaign related to the carceral system in Illinois. So the first question, we're gonna move into questions now. We've been getting some funneling through the chat. If you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. The first one that we have is general. So if any of the panelists have answers to this, it's from Katrina Bao. So it's, to what extent have restorative justice off-ramps like Chicago's restorative justice community courts had an impact on the size of our prison population? Is there any expectation or hope that access to alternative kinds of justice might increase and further impact on our incarceration rates?
I would say that definitely that is impacting, because it's taking a lot of young individuals, particularly young men that come from these marginalized communities, and as an alternative to going to prison, they are doing either community work or they're getting to some type of skill training. And I think that it's proven to be successful. And yes, that is an area where we can invest more money in, to have a type of justice system where we are not thinking punitive measures first, but not past punitive measures. There will be some type of consequences to whatever they've done. And a lot of them do quote unquote nonviolent offenses. So that is an area where I think we can improve on, and we can continue investing in, to avoid someone having to fall into the actual carceral system.
So I'm not going to get into Dr. Dave's area of numbers, but I do want to say this part. Yes, to what Jimmy is saying. However, I do think we need to think about the fact that these types of programs work best in communities. And if you want to look at it, the Chicago Appleseed did a report on the restorative justice court, and how the impact that it was having. Some of the judges are actually using community service in a punitive way, not as in a community building way. And that is because the system is designed to do that. And so when we put these kind of community-based practices in a system that is not really designed to operate in that way, you tend to get this kind of like mixed bag, right? Like, it's doing good, but it is also causing additional harm. And so I just wanted to just lift up that report from Chicago Appleseed, and to also say that what the best version of this type of practice is having it really rooted in community, designed by, delivered by community, and having judges and prosecutors play the least role in that process, because then we end up extracting out the inclination to be punitive in these processes when they weren't designed to be punitive in nature. They were designed for accountability, but not for necessarily for punishment. And so, but I don't want to get into the impact that it's had on the numbers. I'll leave that for Dr.
Yeah, I think the way I'd frame it is alternatives to incarceration or alternatives to formal processing, things like police-led deflection and treatment courts and all that. They're partly behind why these numbers are going down. It's why crime is down. It's why the use of prison is down. Most important thing, though, is that it's got to target people who actually need the intervention and need the services that are offered. And so in the 90s, it was popular to have diversionary programs, but the population that was enrolled was never at risk of their behavior escalating to more serious crime and a prison sentence. And so we had a lot of programs and alternatives developed, and if they were subject to rigorous evaluation, they were found to have no effect. And the reason they didn't have any effect is they weren't targeting people that were at risk in the first place. And so the evolution of some of the specialty courts in Illinois now use best practices where they target individuals that actually need the services, that they're at an elevated risk, and therefore it's effective to provide them with those services. So I can't give you a precise number, but that's partly behind this shift, right? We've recognized that there are alternatives to prison. They may not all be community-based programs, but they are people in the community accessing substance abuse treatment services or mental health services who actually need it. And that's part of the evolution that we've seen over the last couple of decades, and why we've seen a reduced reliance on prison. To Jimmy's point and to Avalon's earlier point, those aren't appropriate for an individual who's been convicted of first-degree murder or armed robbery with a firearm or aggravated battery with a firearm. They're not eligible, right? It carries a mandatory prison sentence. The issue we're wrestling with here is, okay, for accountability's sake, they need to be punished, but at a certain point, that's all we're getting. We're getting punishment. We're not getting any more public safety or rehabilitation.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry if you see my eyes darting. I'm trying to monitor the chat. You all are very popular. I have a question from Tekomiya, and I got your first question. We're going to respond to that in the chat. I'm going to pose the one that might be a little more applicable to the panelists. What steps are being taken to ensure legislative changes prioritize rehabilitation and restorative justice over punitive measures? And how do we hold institutions accountable for implementing these changes? We haven't talked a whole bunch about implementation, but I know that's a big issue too.
So I'm going to go to Chairman Fred Hampton and say, all powers belongs to the people, and that's really what it's going to have to come from us. We do not have a recent experience that I had has really solidified in my mind that we don't have electeds that are ready to do the things that in my opinion I believe are necessary in light of the circumstances that we are experiencing nationally. And so it is going to take us, but I believe in us. I believe in the people. I believe that we can demand more from these systems, not necessarily like using the systems, but demand more and actually make sure that we come up with the policies. It has to come from the people. The top-down approach has not been effective. We've ended up with policies that sound great in theory. Like I think about the resentencing law, where it sounds absolutely great. There are no carve-outs. Yay, win. But then the judges are like, yeah, no, we're not playing that game. We're not going to do it. So then we have this wonderful law that in theory should be helping people get out of these cages, but in practice, the judges are just not playing ball, right? So they're just not going along with it. They're like, "Yep, nope, I'm not going to do it." And so no one is really getting the relief that they need from these laws. And so the implementation part is vital. And then but also the drafting part. Like, we have to start thinking about the way we have been doing policy for more than my lifetime may be inadequate in this moment in time, right? Like, we may need to think about doing it differently and not saying, okay, we're going to get what we can this time, and then 5, 10 years later, come back and get another bite, try to get another bite at the apple. But maybe start thinking about, as we develop policies, think about, like, on the front end, what is our end goal and how do we build to that place, right? We may start here, and it may be an incremental change to get to the North Star, but that the North Star is part of the initial policy. We have to really start thinking about that. How can we be creative with the drafting of policy, but then also the people making sure they're paying attention to what's happening with the implementation part to make sure that it's implemented in the way that it needs to be implemented. And so, like, these judges that are elected that are not playing ball with the resentencing, the public needs to know about that.
Yeah, I'd add, thanks for your question, Tamika. I think that in my experience and the reason why I do the work that I do is rarely do we ever evaluate the policies that we create. Rarely do we ever determine, was it implemented as intended, and did it achieve the goals that it intended? And part of my somewhat sarcastic thinking is the reason is that the goal was to pass the legislation. That was the goal. It was just to get something passed and say that we, in quote, did something. But if it doesn't get implemented, then you didn't do anything other than create another section of the criminal code, right? So, and that's a challenge. I think we need to recognize that we rarely assess the degree to which what we're doing actually is having the intended impact. Yet we continue to invest a lot of money in things that our intuition suggests it'll work. We hope that it'll work. We think it'll work, but no one's ever evaluating it. With truth in sentencing, I describe that as one of the most expensive policies that have ever been created in the state. No one ever evaluated it except for me and my colleagues at Loyola that said, we should evaluate whether or not the predictions that it really won't change sentences have that effect, or the prediction that what it's going to do is it's going to result in individuals in custody engaging in violent behavior and acting out because they had no incentive to follow the rules. What we found was the sentence lengths didn't change. It just doubled how long people spent in prison. And the behavior of the individuals that were subjected to it didn't change. They didn't get more violent. They didn't engage in more disciplinary infractions. And part of it was a misunderstanding about how individuals in custody behave. It was based on a lot of false assumptions. And so, me and my colleagues, that's what we see as our role. We have limited bandwidth. We try to evaluate policies and programs we think are important. Right now, we're evaluating the implementation and impact of Illinois' pretrial reforms that eliminated cash bail and changed all sorts of things. And at times we think, why are we the only ones that had the idea that this should be evaluated? One of the most substantial changes to our state's system, and there's not a lot of people formally evaluating it, critiquing it, assessing whether or not it achieved what everybody said it would.
Thank you. And I have just one last question. And also, if you have any final thoughts to add on to your answer, feel free to do that. After Logan, which prison should be next on the permanent closure list? This question is from Katrina Bao. And there's also a secondary question about what to do with those communities that are losing that economic income from those prisons, if you have any opinions on that. And then just final words, because we're coming to the end of the half hour, but thank you all so much.
I would say that the prisons that should be next would be Pontiac, Menard, Danville, Hill, Dixon. Of course, Logan would be number one, because all of them are in dire disrepair and should be closed. That independent engineering report clearly states that these prisons have both structural and environmental problems and should have been closed years ago. Um, but yeah, I mean, as far as the communities that may lose the prison in there, I think they are our stakeholders as well because they were employed from the IDOC. Nobody wants to see anybody lose their jobs, but at the same time, their their employment is based on this, as we know, a system that's not working. And um, I would think that they should be apportioned some of that money instead of doing the rebuild, put in these communities, find some other you know, sector or job employment that they can have so that they're not left just high and dry, you know. Um, I would think that they should align with us in a push towards closing the prisons and investment in their own community as well as those where the majority of people who are incarcerated come from. So I think if people really understand what's really going on and get educated about that, that there would be more in common than there are differences, and these communities where the prisons are at won't have to suffer some type of industrialization of the PIC.
Yeah, so I I think that what we should be doing is, and I would add Big Muddy because of the culture at Big Muddy to that list. But so and then Decatur and then the rest of them down the road, down the line, all of them as far all 27 gone. Like that's my position. But the reality is that so like to talk about the jobs. I feel like so law enforcement, including corrections officers, have the highest rate of domestic violence happening in their home, higher than the average public person. So it is not healthy for them and their families to be employed in these jobs. So we do need to be thinking about like their well-being. I know that a lot of them, their identity is wrapped up in that power, right? That power to be able to control someone in that way. And we need to think about that, but we also need to talk about what is healthy for you and for your family. And clearly, higher rates of domestic violence is not healthy for them or for their loved ones, right? So we have to address that issue. I would propose a guaranteed basic income program for them. I'm all for GBI. So what we're going to do is, as we upskill you, we're going to put you on a GBI program so that we can get you into other areas, so that you won't lose any income, but you also won't be subjected to this trauma that you're experiencing by going into these facilities. The water is crappy for them, just like it's crappy for the people who have to live there. The environment is hostile for them, just like it's hostile for the people who have to live there, right? Like, so all of those things are not healthy for them. So put them on a guaranteed basic income program, and then have them, have them retrained into other positions with pensions and equivalent benefits, right? So that there is there's no um, it does their standards of living, their compensation is not diminished as a result of the closure of these prisons. But then also telling them that we're doing this for you and for your loved ones because we know the trauma that you're experiencing as a result of going into these buildings that are uninhabitable for any human being, but then they're not even good workplaces. So, and that your community just simply can't rely on the traumatizing of its community members just for jobs.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This was an amazing conversation. I'm really happy to hear all of your perspectives and know that you're all in this fight, and hopefully everyone that's listening can find places to plug in. Clearly there are plenty of places to plug in and to do the work. So I'm going to pass it to Joy just to close us out. Please, if you could, stick around to hear some places that you can take action.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joy Imobio. I'm the policy strategist on the criminal legal systems team at Impact for Equity. Thank you so much again, Avalon, Dr. Dave, and also Jimmy, for just expressing and sharing your expertise with all of us in your lived experience. I want us to just take a moment to take a deep breath. Because this issue is deep, it's heavy, especially not just talking about the policies, but realizing that we're talking about real people locked in cages, and also for people having to relive that experience. So let's just take a deep breath real quick. All right. Because we know that not only is it heavy, but this conversation is needed, right? What we've just experienced together is really a powerful reminder of what's possible when we show up in truth and love and collaboration and also in a pursuit of justice. And so today it wasn't just about the facts or policy, but this was about real people, about lived experience, and also about the power that is within us as a coalition of advocates, researchers, organizers, families, all united by the belief that Illinois can and must do better. And so we've seen firsthand what happens when we do come together just this week. Incredible advocates, including Avalon, spoke at the House subject matter hearing in Springfield and testified about the need to repeal truth in sentencing. And so this is really about people demanding justice, demanding dignity, and demanding change. And as Avalon stated earlier too, it's about the power of the people, right? What's beautiful about really getting involved in this work is that it doesn't just happen at the Capitol. And there are so many ways that we all can get involved. And so one of the most important avenues is to get plugged in with the organizing happening on the ground. And so on Friday, June 6th at 9:30 a.m., we will be gathering again through the Coalition for Collective Liberation, which is a diverse coalition committed to decarceration, prison closures, and also nurturing a new system of justice. And so all supporters are welcome to join that meeting. On Thursday, May 15th at 6 p.m., there's going to be a field screening titled Walls Turn Sideways. And so we invite you all to attend that, bring your friends, come with questions and also solutions. And then lastly, well, not lastly, I have one other last. Impact for Equity, we have an annual fundraiser every year. This year, the theme is Persistence Through Change, and it's happening on June 5th. So please be on the lookout for that and sign up to our newsletter so that you can get updates about the fundraiser that's coming up. And then lastly is please read the entire report on pathways to a future beyond mass incarceration in Illinois that was highlighted today. So read it, share it, talk about it, use it as a tool to challenge the old narratives and also push for the future we deserve. And so this report is to serve as a roadmap, but it's the people like you that really make it real. And so I just want to thank everybody for joining today. If anyone has any additional questions or wants to get connected, please feel free to reach out to Andrea Dantes, who led and authored the report. We'll post her email in the chat if you're not connected. And again, thank you all so much for being here. Let's stay connected, stay committed, and let's keep walking forward together.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.